Hey everybody, a little walk and talk. It's gonna be hard with the dog. But a loyal listener and viewer has for a very long time, he hasn't done it recently, but for a long time, he was sending me links to Tim Pool talking about the coming American Civil War, Civil War 2.0 or whatever. And I just wasn't interested. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I'm willing to engage in the topic. And when I say out of nowhere, it comes as a result of this tweet, which I don't have a free hand with which to hold the other phone and actually read the tweet. So I can't see it, but it's something to the effect of the U.S. Civil War wasn't a normal civil war. Basically, with the exception of Missouri, we just divided neatly into two countries and had a normal war. And that, modern civil wars and most civil wars, they're not divided so neatly into discrete geographical packets that then go to war with one another. It tends to be a lot messier and a lot nastier. And an important aspect of that is that in the early stages, when the erupting chaos has disrupted the normal law and order, people take that opportunity to settle a lot of scores. And that got me thinking, well, here I am living in not only red America, but rural red America, far from any city of any size. And while I have family connections here, I don't really have any social connections here. I don't know anybody here, which is kind of a bummer because, I'm definitely an exemplar of the social isolation of males generally and of middle-aged males in the United States. But I'd rather be a socially isolated middle-aged male than a socially isolated 20-something male. But I was thinking, in the event of an actual breakout of open hostilities, between red and blue, basically, with blue mostly being centered in urban areas and red being in rural areas, I'd much rather be out here in the rural areas. And my social isolation and the fact that I don't have long-standing histories with anybody out here means that there aren't people nearby who would take the opportunity to settle old scores with me. Because I just don't have anybody like that around here. Knock on bat box. Wait for that plane to go by. Hey, man. Actually, I'm going to take a break and talk to a neighbor. Oh, all right. Well, last video ended with me. I start off saying, "Hey, I'm socially isolated, don't know anybody here," and then it ends with me saying, "Hey, man," and then hanging up, stopping the video and going to talk to somebody. But he doesn't live here full time. He lives in Montana, and he comes around just a few times a year. But now I'm at the dog park, my usual recording spot. And I just started recording, and then somebody I know showed up with her dogs. But she's on the phone on the other side of a dog park, so I'll keep talking. But socially isolated as I am, when I step outside my house, I, not invariably, but sometimes encounter people that I know and am friendly with, which is good. But at the same time, that means I could also be developing relationships with people that I'm unfriendly with, and that takes us back to when law and order breaks down, people take the opportunity to settle scores. Civil War 2.0, coming Civil War in the United States. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Would it look like the previous one? No. I think that Twitter user whose name I don't have committed to memory was correct in that it would be more like, Sarajevo during the Balkans War in the 90s. Or, Beirut at various periods. But basically a war where the different factions are not exactly equally distributed across the landscape, but not neatly parceled out into whole states on one side or the other. And I think I've been reading about this and taking in some videos, and I haven't taken in any podcasts yet, but I intend to. But the general consensus is that the war would break down to hostilities and armed violence between people living in urban areas and people living in rural areas. and I'm in a town of about 5,000 in a very rural area. But the factors to consider so far, this is going to be very preliminary. I imagine I'm going to hear from some of you, and you're going to have your opinions, and you're also going to point me towards sources of information which you think are credible and useful on this topic. But in thinking about a civil war largely fought between cities and rural areas, well, the cities can't feed themselves. The rural areas, since the United States abolished the draft and basically the makeup of the armed forces is determined by, people's attitudes toward military service and also by, varying levels of opportunity for different types of education, technical training, and employment. People living out here, they don't have as many options as people living in cities. And also the culture out here in the countryside values honor and also values military service and, affords honor to people who serve in the military. Whereas, when I lived in New York City, I never knew anybody who served in the military. And the people that I associated with there, these are like the artists, sort of Burning Man type people. They didn't know anybody who was in the military, and they wouldn't, knowingly associate with anybody who was in the military. Whereas here, I haven't seen it recently, but, I have seen people wearing their military uniforms to Walmart. It's just a very different attitude. So a lot more, per capita, more people in the military are from rural areas than they are from urban areas. And there is a much greater, not just stockpile of weapons out here in the rural areas, because, in the more progressive an urban area, the stricter the gun control laws, and the more that law-abiding people have been systematically disarmed and, probably raised with the values of just relying on the police for self-protection. Well, it's not self-protection in that instance, but for protection. And so not only do you have fewer armaments, in the city, you've got the police forces, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. There's a lot more police in urban areas, and they are armed and they are trained. But they are much more likely to be sympathetic toward the rural value set, in any armed conflict. And the same goes for the military. The leadership in the military is blue, but the rank and file is red. So there will come a time, most likely, if the gloves are off and guns are firing and people are dying, it is entirely likely that, officers will get fragged, as they used to say in Vietnam. And that, whole units will switch sides, I was going to say go rogue, but they wouldn't be going rogue. They would just be, changing allegiance, their official allegiance, to match their actual internal organic allegiance. But when it comes to armed conflict between the cities and the rural areas, the cities, what do they have on their side? They've got numbers. They've got a lot of people. But numbers aren't necessarily an advantage. If they're not combatants, if they're not competent combatants and not capable of being trained up to be such in a short period of time, or not willing, if they are so opposed to militarism in general that even in an armed conflict in their own country, they refuse to fight, well, then, their numbers are not, they're not a benefit. Although I know that many young liberals are eager to fight. Young men in general are eager to fight. What else the cities would have on their sides is technology. A lot of manufacturing is in the cities. A lot of high-tech businesses, all high-tech businesses basically are in the cities. Universities, many of them are in big cities. There's going to be a deep pool of technical talent in the cities to draw on. And then that got me to thinking about, well, what would be the role of AI in a conflict, a Civil War 2.0 conflict in the United States? And it seems like the sooner the conflict actually entered into the active phase, the active shooting phase, the better it would be for the red team. Because the further into the future the onset of the hostilities is, the more that autonomous lethal weapons platforms are, which is to say, killer robots, will be at play. And the killer robots will mostly be on Team Blue. Now, everybody will have, consumer level drones for like guerrilla level street warfare, but the blue team is probably going to have the big boy drones way up in the sky that you can't even see, but they can kill you, with the press of a button. But the U.S. has had that advantage over all of its Middle Eastern adversaries for the past couple of decades, and it hasn't been decisive. That pacification, while certainly asymmetrical, while certainly lopsided in terms of raw power, it hasn't been a cakewalk and it's not over. And it certainly hasn't and won't be ending in, absolute victory. Look at Afghanistan. So ultimately, and this is something I've been talking about this with both Claude and Pi, and they both say, "Hey, don't be deterministic, don't be pessimistic, don't be fatalistic," and I agree. I'm not suddenly convinced that a civil war, like a hot war, in the United States between different cultural factions is inevitable. I think it's possible. I think it's worth talking about, but I don't want to set it up as some fixed feature of the near future, which we absolutely have to navigate around. It's one thing to think about among many. All right, hit me up. What are your opinions? What would you like me to take into my thinking on this topic, and what sources of information do you think I should avail myself of? All right, I'm out. Catch you later.